No visual contact.
Some deaths are accidents. This one was a choice, 100 small choices. You trust the map because thousands of people walked this trail before you. You trust the weather because the sky's blue where you parked the car. You trust the footprints in the snow because someone else went first. And the wilderness does not care about any of that. It does not care how many 5-star reviews a trail has collected online. It does not care that you are less than an hour from one of the largest cities in the country. It does not care that you have hiked this exact route a dozen times before, in a different season, under a different sky. Ice does not negotiate. Gravity does not hesitate. By the time the ground under your boots stops behaving like a hiking trail and starts behaving like a mountain, you have already made decisions that are becoming difficult to reverse. The summit is not what traps people. The belief that they are still on an ordinary hike is what traps them. These are the warnings they ignored. This is preventable. A mountain that pretends to be a hike. Mount San Antonio rises above the Angeles National Forest at 10,064 feet, a jagged white shoulder visible from freeway lanes, office windows, and backyard fence lines across the Los Angeles basin. Locals call it Mount Baldy, and the name suggests something gentle, something bald and rounded and safe, like a hill that ran out of ambition halfway up. In summer, it is close to that, a steep grind, but a trail. Switchbacks worn smooth by decades of boots. A summit register at the top and a view that stretches, on a clear day, all the way to the ocean. In winter, almost none of that is true. Mount Baldy sits an hour's drive from a metropolis of nearly 13 million people, and every year it draws thousands of hikers who have never once stood on true ice in their lives. They come because a phone app rated the trail moderate. They come because a friend posted a photograph from the summit with a caption about conquering the day. They come because the mountain looks from the freeway like nothing more than a big hill with the dusting of frosting on top, something you could reasonably knock out before lunch. What the photographs do not show is what happens to that same trail in January. Snow does not just cover the path, it erases it. Landmarks disappear. The subtle cues a hiker relies on without even noticing. A worn line of dirt, a cluster of familiar rocks, a bend where the trail always bends, vanish under a uniform white surface that offers no information about what lies beneath it. And on the steep sections near the summit ridge, that snow does not stay soft. Wind and freeze-thaw cycles compact and harden it, day after day, until a hiking trail becomes something closer to a climbing route with the same consequences for a fall. Mountaineering equipment is not a suggestion at that point. It is the difference between a controlled descent and a slide with no way to stop it. Search and rescue teams in San Bernardino County will tell anyone who asks that the mountain almost never surprises them. They have seen this exact sequence before, season after season, sometimes more than once in a single winter. A hiker checks a forecast for the trailhead and never checks one for the summit, 3,000 feet higher and 20 degrees colder. A hiker sees other footprints in the snow and assumes that because someone else walked there, the ground must be safe, never considering that those footprints might belong to someone who also should have turned back. It is not the mountain that surprises anyone in these cases. It is the hikers, arriving prepared for a trail that, for 4 or 5 months out of the year, no longer exists in any form they would recognize. The last hike. For one experienced Southern California outdoorsman, the mountain would become another entry in a tragedy that rescuers had watched unfold many times before. Julian Sands was not a stranger to wild places. The British actor, known across decades of film work, had built a quieter reputation among people who actually knew him. A reputation as a serious hiker, someone who sought out difficult terrain deliberately rather than accidentally, who treated the mountains of California less like scenery and more like a second home. Friends and family described a man who hiked often, who understood elevation, who was drawn specifically to demanding routes rather than easy ones. He had reportedly hiked Baldy before. He knew the trailhead. He knew, at least in warmer months, the shape of the switchbacks. On January 13th, 2023, he set out to hike Mount Baldy alone. For Julian Sands, this winter hike would become his last. He did not return that evening. When he failed to check in, family members reported him overdue. And within hours, a search was already underway on a mountain that had already been battered by one of the most severe winter storm systems Southern California had seen in years. A mountain that, unbeknownst to much of the public watching the search unfold on the news, had already sent multiple other hikers home in ambulances or helicopters in the weeks prior. The mountain had already warned everyone. Everything that followed had already been described in advance in forecasts, advisories, and years of rescue reports that most people never read until after a tragedy makes headlines. In the weeks before sand set out, an atmospheric river had moved through California, dumping feet of snow across the San Gabriel Mountains and burying trails under conditions closer to the High Sierra in February than to a Los Angeles day hike in January. Snow accumulated in drifts along exposed ridgelines, some deep enough to swallow a hiker to the waist. Wind above treeline compacted that snow into hard-packed ice on the steepest sections of the route, the same sections that in July are simply a dusty scramble a fit hiker barely notices. The National Weather Service had issued winter weather advisories for the San Gabriel Range in the days surrounding the storm system, warning of hazardous travel, high winds, and dangerously cold temperatures at elevation. The Angeles National Forest had posted its own seasonal warnings, the kind repeated nearly every winter without fail. Crampons and an ice axe required beyond a certain point on the trail. Inexperienced hikers strongly discouraged from attempting a summit push under current conditions. The San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, whose search and rescue teams patrol Baldy more frequently than almost any other peak in the region, had already issued repeated public notices in the weeks prior. The kind of notices that read, in hindsight, like a script rescuers wish fewer families had to live through twice in one season. Numerous rescues had already taken place on Baldy during that same storm system in the days before SANS arrived. Hikers stranded on ice, unable to move up or down. Hikers turned back by wind strong enough to knock a person off their feet. Hikers who had, through some combination of luck and remaining daylight, made it down before conditions became unsurvivable for them. The mountain had been sending the same message for weeks: it does not shout. It repeats itself quietly in weather bulletins and Sheriff's Department press releases until someone finally stops listening. The mountain had not changed overnight. The conditions had, and every decision from that point forward depended entirely on recognizing the difference between the trail a hiker remembered from a warmer month and the mountain that was actually standing in front of them now. A hiking app does not know the difference either. It shows a route, a dotted line drawn across a digital map based on where other people's feet happened to travel in seasons past. That dotted line does not vanish in winter. It sits there on the screen, calm and precise and confident, even when the actual ground beneath it is buried under 3 feet of windblown ice. A phone can tell a hiker exactly where the trail used to be. It cannot tell them whether it is safe to stand there now. It cannot feel the wind. It cannot see the ice under the snow. It has no concept of danger at all, only coordinates. The chain of small choices. This is the first link in a chain that investigators and search teams have watched form on Baldy for years, and it rarely breaks at just one point. It breaks decision by decision, small compromise, until the last one becomes unsurvivable. The first decision is treating a winter ascent like an ordinary hike. Distance and elevation gains stay identical in January to what they are in July. Almost nothing else does. Daylight is shorter, sometimes by hours. Temperatures at the summit can sit 20 or 30 degrees colder than the trailhead parking lot, where a hiker last checked the weather before starting the climb. The ground itself changes texture and angle and grip beneath every single step, and none of that shows up on a trail map. The second decision is believing that familiarity with a route in one season transfers automatically to another. A trail hiked a dozen times in summer can still ambush a hiker in winter, because the danger was never really the distance or the elevation gain. It was always the surface underfoot, and that surface under ice is unrecognizable, even to someone who has walked the same path 100 times before. The third decision is trusting navigation over conditions, following the blue dot on a screen past the point where the visible trail has physically disappeared, because the app insists the route continues straight ahead through what is now a featureless slope of ice and snow. GPS knows where a hiker is standing to within a few meters. It does not know whether the ground beneath that hiker will hold their weight, or whether the next step is onto solid footing or onto a wind-loaded slab with nothing underneath it. The fourth decision is continuing on past the point where turning around was still the safer option. Search and rescue teams have a name for what happens next: summit fever. The mind fixates on the goal that is now visible, close, seemingly within reach, and every hour effort already spent starts to feel like a reason to keep going rather than a reason to stop. Sunk cost stops being an abstract term from an economics class and becomes a live, physical pull uphill. "I'm almost there" becomes the most dangerous sentence a hiker can say to themselves on a mountain like this one, because it is rarely true, and even when it is true, "almost there" says nothing about what it will take to get back down. The fifth decision concerns equipment. Forest Service guidance for winter travel on Baldy is specific and repeated nearly every season without change. Crampons for traction on ice, and the ice axe for self-arrest if a fall begins, a helmet for the rock and ice fall common on the upper slopes, and a working understanding of avalanche terrain and how to read it. What equipment SANS carried that day has not been confirmed publicly, And speculation on that point would serve no one. It would only replace fact with guesswork. What is confirmed beyond dispute is that the terrain he entered required all of it, and that the mountain does not make exceptions for the unequipped, however experienced they may otherwise be. The sixth decision was traveling alone. Solo travel is not by itself reckless. Experienced mountaineers do it regularly, and skill can offset some of the risk. But it removes a critical safety margin that no amount of skill can fully replace. There is no second person to notice a slip before it becomes a fall. No partner to call for help the moment something goes wrong. No one to notice fading coordination, slowed speech, or the subtle changes in behavior that often precede a medical emergency in the cold. Every minute that passes between an incident and a rescue call is a minute the mountain gets to work uninterrupted and alone. That clock starts running the moment something goes wrong, not the moment someone standing beside you happens to notice. By the time any single one of these choices becomes obviously dangerous, the ones that came before it are usually already impossible to undo. That is the nature of a chain. It does not announce which link is the last one that could have been broken safely. When the mountain takes control, what happens to a human body on an exposed winter mountain is not mysterious. It has been studied, documented, and repeated in mountain rescue reports for decades. It is clinical, not dramatic, and that clinical quality is precisely what makes it so unforgiving. Cold stress begins with the body's own defense mechanism working against the extremities to protect the core. Blood vessels near the skin constrict, pulling warm blood inward toward the vital organs. That process, called peripheral vasoconstriction, sacrifices the hands and feet first. Fingers lose dexterity within minutes of serious cold exposure. Hands lose the fine motor control needed to grip an ice axe properly, to adjust a crampon strap that has come loose, or even to operate a phone screen to call for help. A hiker in this state may still feel largely capable. They are not, and the gap between how capable they feel and how capable they actually are keeps widening the longer they stay exposed. As core temperature continues to drop, hypothermia begins to affect the brain itself, not just the limbs. Judgment narrows, reaction time slows. Decision-making, the very thing that got a hiker into trouble in the first place, becomes even less reliable exactly when it is needed most. In a cruel irony well documented in cold weather medicine, some hypothermic patients grow more confident even as their physical capability collapses. Misjudging distances, underestimating slope angle, convinced they can manage one more traverse, one more descent, when their body has already stopped being able to execute it safely. On a mountain like Baldy in winter, this physiological state and the surrounding terrain interact in the worst possible combination. A slip on hard packed ice without an ice axe to arrest the fall does not simply end in a stumble and a bruise. It can become an uncontrolled slide, gathering speed across a slope with no natural stopping point, ending only where the terrain finally forces it to stop. Against exposed rock, against a tree trunk, into a ravine well below the visible trail line. Self-rescue in that scenario requires precisely the skills, strength, and equipment that a hypothermic body and an unprepared pack are least likely to be able to provide in the moment. And then there is nightfall. At elevation in January, daylight is a resource that runs out fast, sometimes faster than a tired, cold hiker expects. And once it does, visibility collapses along with it. Temperatures drop further still. Wind chill accelerates heat loss dramatically. Isolation, already heightened by solo travel, becomes near total, and the margin for error that had been shrinking all day narrows to almost nothing. What exactly happened during Julian Sands' final hours on that mountain has never been confirmed publicly, and this account will not pretend otherwise or fill in details that are not known. What can be said, based on the terrain he entered and the conditions present that day, is that his situation was consistent with the same physiological progression search and rescue teams have documented on Baldy for years. Exposure, compromised judgment, and terrain that does not forgive a single uncorrected mistake, regardless of who is making it. The search that became a recovery. When rescuers finally began searching in earnest, the mountain had already begun erasing the evidence of what happened. The search that followed was one of the largest in the region's recent history. On January 13th, Sands was reported overdue, and San Bernardino County Sheriff's search and rescue teams mobilized immediately, understanding from long experience exactly what a delayed report on a storm-bashed Baldy usually meant. Helicopters were dispatched, then grounded, repeatedly, as the same severe weather that had made the mountain so dangerous in the first place made aerial search impossible for days at a time. Drone teams were deployed to scan terrain too hazardous for ground crews to approach directly, hovering over ravines and chutes that no rescuer could safely enter on foot. Volunteer search and rescue personnel, some of the most experienced mountain teams in the state, combed the peak's drainages, and exposed slopes on foot, working in conditions that occasionally forced commanders to suspend operations entirely, not for lack of will, but for the safety of the searchers themselves. Cell phone location data offered only rough guidance, not precision, and in terrain this steep and this remote, rough guidance can mean a search radius measured in acres rather than feet. Days turn into weeks. The initial intensive search wound down without a recovery, and the case moved into a slower, quieter, more painful phase. Periodic searches conducted over the following months as weather and conditions allowed, hope narrowing a little more with each search that came back empty. On June 24, 2023, more than 5 months after Sands set out on his hike, human remains were discovered on Mount Baldy. On June 27th, the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department confirmed the identification. Julian Sands was gone. In the aftermath, the story became something larger than one hiker's disappearance. It became a renewed public conversation about a mountain that seems to have the same conversation running every winter, almost on a schedule. About hiking apps that display a route without ever displaying a risk level attached to it. About a peak so visible from a major city that its accessibility seems to quietly contradict its danger. About sheriff's departments that issue the same seasonal warnings nearly every year, only to watch them go unread by the next wave of hikers arriving with the next clear sky forecast. Baldy's search and rescue teams have said publicly, in various forms across various years, some version of the same sentence. This mountain is more dangerous than it looks from the freeway, and popularity has never once made a summit safer to stand on. The investigation into Sands' death ended the way most mountain fatalities eventually do. Not with blame assigned to the terrain itself, because the terrain was never trying to do anything to anyone. It simply never offered forgiveness for the decisions made against it, and it never will, for the next hiker who makes the same ones. Every wilderness disaster has a moment when survival is still the most likely outcome. Sometimes that moment arrives days earlier, at a desk, in front of a weather forecast still open on a screen and closed without a second look. Sometimes it arrives at the trailhead in a decision to go alone rather than wait for company. Sometimes it is the exact instant a hiker notices that the trail has disappeared beneath the snow entirely and chooses to keep climbing anyway, because turning around feels, in that specific moment, like the harder choice to make. The hardest lesson from Mount Baldy is not that the mountain is unusually cruel. It is that it looks ordinary right up until the moment it stops being ordinary, and by then the ground has already changed beneath the boots of someone who is still making decisions for the trail they remember, not for the mountain that is actually there in front of them. Julian Sands was remembered by those who knew him as a gifted actor, a devoted father, and someone who genuinely loved wild places. Not recklessly, but deeply, the way people love something they have spent years learning to respect, rather than something they merely visit for a photograph. His story is not a story about carelessness in the ordinary sense. It is a story about how experience, on its own, cannot overcome conditions that demand different preparation, different equipment, and a different decision than the one that felt familiar and comfortable. A turnaround is never a failure. Ignoring the mountain's warnings can be. Break the chain at any single one of those choices, and the ending changes completely. Leave one decision unchallenged, and every decision that follows becomes harder and harder to take back, until the last one is no longer a decision at all, only a consequence. And every step of it was preventable. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing. It might be the cheapest piece of survival gear you ever pick up. Want more preventable? These stories are next. Thank you for watching.